So, um, good morning, everyone, or good whatever time of day it is where you are. Thank you very much for joining us for the second session in Rabbi Silber's series on the Book of Exodus, Reclaiming the Past and Building the Future. I have invited everyone to be a panelist. That means that if you so choose, you can show your smiling face or you can unmute to ask for questions when we pause for those. Otherwise, you can put any questions that you have into the chat and I'll make sure that they get into to Rabbi Silber. Um, uh, and you can do that here or on Facebook Live. Um, and that's the usual housekeeping, and I think I will just pass it on to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. We're actually in the second chapter of the book of Shemot, Sefer Shemot. We saw last week the birth of Moshe, and let's begin now with the 11th pasuk. Moshe is growing up. Since Vahi bayamim ahem, vayigdal Moshe vayetzer lechav vayar b'sivrotam vayar ish b'tzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. So in those days, sometime after that, or in that time, Moshe grows up, goes out to his brothers, to his brethren. He sees their suffering. He sees an Egyptian, Ish Mitzri, beating or hitting a Hebrew, an Ish Ivri Me'echav. So actually, it's interesting that in the pasuk, when you first read the verse, Moshe went out, and he went out to his brothers, Echav. And before you read the next couple of words, I don't think the reader can know actually who his brothers are. Because at the end of the day, this is a fellow, a child, or now a young fellow, who has two different mothers. He's brought up by the Egyptian woman, by Pharaoh's daughter, as it says, he was her child. By he's her child. On the other hand, he has his natural biological mother who also nurses him. So which one is it? Who is Echav? Is Echav the Egyptians? Are they his brethren? Or is it the Hebrews? And you don't discover that until you read the next two words, namely Vayar b'sivrotam. He saw their save or their hard labor. And then you realize that Echav actually are the Jews, are the Israelites, and not the Egyptians. And really the question one can ask is, how does Moshe come to make this choice? How does Moshe come to identify himself as one of the as one of the Hebrews? And here I think there are two different possibilities to understand how it comes to pass that Moshe sees himself, that Echav in the verse is actually Hebrews. One possibility is that he chooses to be a Hebrew. He could be either one. He has a dual identity, but he chooses to be a Hebrew specifically because of Vayar b'sivrotam. In other words, he goes out, he sees people being beaten up. So he decides to identify with the people that are being beaten up. Vayar b'sivrotam. That is certainly one possibility. And Vayar ish b'tzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. So that's therefore the Echav in the verse turns out to be the Ish Ivri from his brethren who was being beaten by the Ish Mitzri. That's certainly one possibility. I don't remember if I suggested last week a second possibility. I think they're both good viable options here. But the second possibility, what I suggested, I think last week, I can't remember anymore, so I'll suggest it now. And that is that it's true that he has an Egyptian mother, Paro's daughter, and it's true he has a Hebrew mother who nurses him. That is true. But actually, there's a third person involved in the story. Because if you recall, it's not just about his mother and Paro's daughter, the two women who are his mothers, but rather there's a third person. The third person is, as mentioned in the previous verses, his sister, we are told, stood from afar to see what would happen to him, or rather to know what would happen to him with they are. And that is found earlier in the second chapter. That's in verse number, let's find that, in verse number 4. So the point is, there actually are 3 women in the story. There's his own natural mother, there's his adopted mother, but then there's the third party. When I say it's the third verse that determines it. And there it's his sister. It's Achoto. So in the question of what does Moshe decide that Echav are his brethren? Well, I'll tell you why. Because he has a sister. He has an Ach. In this case, an Achot. He has a sibling. The sibling who was watching over him from a distance, caring for him, rushing down to the banks of the river and asking Pharaoh's daughter if she needs child needs a nursemaid, etc., brings him back to his natural mother. So maybe that's the reason for Moshe's decision to choose to be Me'echav, means the Hebrew. So I suggested 2 different possibilities. One is that it's actually a choice that he makes. He has the opportunity to be whatever he wants to be because he has 2 identities, but he chooses based on his sense of equity, of fairness. He chooses to be with the oppressed ones rather than with the oppressors. That's one possibility. And then there's the other possibility. They don't actually contradict because people's decisions typically are not a function of just one thing. They're a function often of a whole web of things. And we make our decisions based on a lot of different factors. Sometimes it's hard for us even to know why we chose what we chose. We chalk it up to intuition or whatever, but typically there are reasons. If we try to break it down after the fact, we can probably figure it out. In any event, he has chosen to be an Ivri. Now, there's something else over here. Well, I'm going to read a little bit more, and then I'll stop and take comments and questions. Now, the next verse, we're in verse number 12. So he sees the Egyptian beating, Bakem means beating or hitting, the Hebrew. Vayifen kol v'cho, in verse number 12, he looks this way and that way, kol v'cho, this way and that way. Vayar ki ein ish, he saw there was no man, that is, no one is around. I'll get back to that in a minute. Vayachet hamitzri, vayit b'nehu b'cho, he hit the Egyptian and he buried him in the sand. So this verse has some interesting pieces to it. The first question I would ask is, he looks this way and that way. Vayar ki ein ish, he saw there was no ish, there was no man. Which could mean 2 different things, actually. It could mean he looks this way and that way, that before he decides to take action, and this is an act that will change his life, actually. Before he takes an act that will radically change his life, he wants to see if anybody will see what he's doing. He looks around, there's no one around, so nobody will know what he's doing. And therefore, he's free to take action, thinking there won't be any consequences because nobody knows what I did. That is certainly one viable reading. That Vayar ki ein ish is because he's concerned that maybe we'll see that he actually hits the Egyptian, which I would point out is not just a matter of hitting an Egyptian. It's much more than that. The reason this is an act that changes his life is because what he's actually doing is taking up arms against the institution of slavery. We're not talking about just one person hitting another. We're talking about the mystery being the Ivri. Remember, the context of all of this is slavery. As it said in the first chapter, 5 different times in chapter 1, the verb ayin bet dalet, eved avad, slave is an eved is a slave. It's part of the slavery. So when Moshe kills the Mitzri, he's actually striking a blow against the institution of slavery, and that is dangerous. Paro might not care if you kill an Egyptian or 2. Who cares? Paro doesn't. But he does care if you take up arms against the institution that he's using to suppress the outsiders, the Hebrews, the strangers. So that's one possible reading of Vayif and Kol V'cho, Vayar ki ein ish. But there's another viable reading as well, and that is Vayif and Kol V'cho, Vayar ki ein ish is not so much he's worried about people knowing what he's doing and then there'll be severe consequences, but maybe it's something else. Here he is coming into the situation, and one fellow is beating up somebody else. And Moshe looks around and he says to himself, maybe, this seems very unfair to me, but I'm sure the authorities will deal with it. He looks around and there's nobody, ein ish, in the sense that there's nobody else who's going to stop it. It reminds me of what it says in Pirkei Avot, b'makom she'ein ish, in a place where there is no ish, and then be a man. Be a man where there are no people. In other words, when no one else is doing what they're supposed to be doing, b'makom she'ein ish, this is when you have a responsibility. That's a very, very different reading. He was hoping somebody else, the system, whatever you want to call it, would protect people. And when he looks around, he recognizes no one else. There may be 100 people around, but no one is going to do anything about it. Now, it is true, he does try to hide what he did, because it says after he smote the Egyptian, he buried him in the sand. So in other words, he's trying to cover it up. It reminds me very much of the first story of the Torah, Cain and Hevel. When Cain kills Hevel, apparently he buried him in the ground. God said to Cain, "Where's your brother?" "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" "What do you mean?" The blood cries out from the ground. Or the brother said about Joseph, "Let's kill him and throw him into the pit. The earth will cover it up." So Moshe does think over here that maybe he can save the Hebrew or protect the Hebrew, and nobody will know one way or the other. There's no one around, no one's going to know, and besides, the body's underground, it's buried in the sand. So perhaps that's what he's thinking as well. I did want to make two other points about this verse, and then I'll stop and take questions. One is a point that I read many, many years ago. I believe it was in an article by Sternberg and Perry. They're interesting. They're one of the first people to talk about a kind of literary approach to the study of Bible. And they pointed out something very interesting. The question is, what Moshe does, Moshe's act, is this a justifiable act or not? Let's stop and think about that for a moment. Is what Moshe does justifiable, or is it problematic? Well, to rephrase the question, I wouldn't ask the question if it was justifiable, would I? So therefore, what about what Moshe does might be seen by somebody as being unjustifiable? So somebody want to suggest, what is it about that's perhaps unjustifiable or questionable? Now, these are the kinds of questions that nowadays, with the war here in Israel and the Gaza Strip and all that, it raises a host of questions about war and about self-defense, which is what it essentially is, etc. But there are all kinds of interesting questions that it raises, and painful questions. The question one could raise, I'll say, if no one's going to speak up, I'll say what the question is. The question is this: he sees the Egyptian makeh. That's what it said in the verse. Now, lahakot means to hit or to beat. For example, the Torah says, makeh ish v'meit mot yumad. If someone hits someone else and he dies, then there's capital offense, and the person who hits, that is, who kills, should die. But the Torah also speaks of, what about if you injure somebody, if you hit somebody, but the person doesn't die? Then there's different rules. Then we have the rules about, damages. I mean, damage of property, damage of wounding another person. What's called chovel b'chavero. So the Gemara speaks about the various, yes, Parshas Mishpatim, it certainly is, and Torah, the Talmud, the Mishnah speaks about the 5 different payments one might have to make. Something called nezek, and then there's the doctor bills and the unemployment. The person can't work, and the pain, you have to put a value on pain, etc. Over here, the Egyptian is beating the Jew. He's hitting the Jew. It doesn't say he killed the Jew. Now, it could be that he might have ended up killing him, but at this point, he didn't kill him. But Moshe kills the Egyptian. So the question is this, in fact, proportionate? It seems disproportionate. Reuven's hitting Shimon, or beating Shimon. It comes along Levi and kills Reuven. Is that justified or not? That to me is a very interesting question. Now, the point that Sternberg or Perry, this is talking 50 years ago, I remember reading this and saying that's a very good point. And the point that they make actually is that the Torah uses the same verb for both. Moshe saw the Mitzri makeh ish ivri me'achav, and what Moshe does is vayachet ha-Mitzri vayitbeneu bachol. The claim they make, which I think has something to it, is that the very fact that Torah uses the same verb for both actions is a way of the Torah, one might say, attempting to justify, certainly, having a sympathetic view towards what Moshe does. The very fact of using that same verb. I'll tell you where Sternberg makes a similar point, although I think he misreads the story. Although many people will claim his reading. In my view, it's not a good reading. But the story of Shechem. In the story of Shechem, as we all know, back in chapter 34 of Breshit, so it's the story of Dinah, who is raped by Shechem, and then he wants to marry her afterwards. Those kinds of negotiations, and the brothers, two in particular, after the town is immobilized or the men are immobilized through circumcision, they massacre the entire town. They kill the whole town of Shechem. And the question, of course, the question that is obvious, is can one justify this or not? Or can even one, if not fully justified, can one be somewhat sympathetic to what they did? Sternberg thinks very much yes. In fact, he thinks the Torah takes their side. I disagree. But one point he makes is interesting, which is the very fact that the perpetrator of the crime is named Shechem, and the town is Shechem, does suggest some kind of identification between the town on one hand and the person on the other. Even if it's not a logical identification, it's a kind of literary identification, which does say something about the brothers' action. And in some sense, one could use that as a point in their favor, I would say. I think the Shechem story is much more complicated, nor do I think the Torah takes anybody's side, nor does the Torah have to take somebody's side. The Torah condemns everybody, but in any event, the point they're making is the identification in language very often, does speak to a kind of, if not a full justification, certainly an explanation of what the person did. So over here we do have the Vayach. Now I want to say something else, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions about these two seemingly innocent verses that we have read. In the previous verse, it said Moshe went out, Vayar b'siv lotam, that's in verse number 10. In verse 10, I think it is, yes? Verse 11, I'm sorry, in verse 11, he saw the suffering, he saw the labors. Vayar ish Mitzri, he saw the Egyptian hitting the Hebrew. Then he looks the next verse, our verse, he looks this way, that way. Vayar kienish, he saw that there's no man, no one's around. He kills the Egyptian and buries him. So what I noticed, I'm sure we all noticed it, that in these two verses, the Torah uses the verb to see 3 times. He saw the suffering, he saw the Egyptian, he saw nobody was there, and he smites the Egyptian. Now, there is a medrash about this, which is very interesting. I can't get into the whole medrash now. It's an extremely interesting medrash. Medrash asks the question, who is this guy? Who is this fellow that is being beaten by the Egyptian? And the medrash has the following story. The Egyptian is a taskmaster, and I can't get into the whole medrash now. It plays off another text I don't want to get into. But the short of it is this, that this taskmaster, he goes to the house. This has different forms of the medrash. He goes to the house. The Hebrew is working wherever he's working, maybe building some store cities or whatever. And the taskmaster goes to the house, and he sees his wife in the house. And he ends up sleeping with this guy's wife. Whether she's complicit or not, the different midrashim. Let's say she's not complicit. So he basically abuses her. And then he goes back to work, and he suspects that the Hebrew worker suspects him. He thinks that the Hebrew worker suspects him, so he beats the Hebrew worker. That's the medrash, and I think Rashi, I have Rashi in front of me. I think Rashi quotes that medrash. There's much more to the Medrash, but that's what the Medrash says. There's more to it. And I just wanted to say that question when we see a Medrash, the question we ask immediately is, what is the Medrash trying to teach us? That's the right question. Very often it's other questions. What did the Medrash see in the text? It's another question, or a set of texts. Let's leave that out. But what is the Medrash saying over here? So I want to make a suggestion as to what it's saying. I think what it's saying is this: we human beings, we create institutions, and there are reasons for institutions actually. But the point is, there are all kinds of institutions, and none is perfect. Obviously, institutions are a product of human beings, and since we are all imperfect beings, our institutions, by their nature, will be imperfect. Some will be worse than others, though, that we know. But the point over here, I think what the Medrash is saying, is that this institution of slavery is negative, not just because people can beat up other people, but because it lends itself to beating up other people without cause. In other words, under the guise of, I'm sure, hey, how come you're not working? So he beats up the Hebrew. That's not the real reason. The real reason is that the other fellow suspects him. So under the institution of slavery, you can get away with a lot of things. And I think maybe what they're picking up on is the threefold use of the verb to see. What does Moshe says the Medrash? I'm guessing. So if the Medrash doesn't say it, you can blame it on me. But what the point is, why Moshe sees and Moshe sees and Moshe sees? What does he see? That's exactly what he sees, says the Medrash. He sees that under this slavery business, you can get away with literally with murder. And that's what Moshe sees about slavery. It's bad in and of itself. And it's also bad because under the guise of this institution, there are all kinds of abuses are possible. I would just add, without getting into any details now, I think this is true of every institution. And I think what institutions have to do is to every so often self-examine and ask ourselves the question, if we have an institution which under whose auspices there are all kinds of bad things happening, then maybe we have to tinker with the institution or figure out how we can strengthen our institutions so that they fully reflect our values. I don't want to get into that now, but in any event, that I think is what the Medrash is getting at. And if it's not the Medrash, I suggest the triple use of to see. Vayar, Vayar, and once again, Vayar, and he buries him in the sand. Let me just stop here for a minute. If anybody has comments or questions, otherwise we'll just continue.
Yes.
Yes.
One can see this situation as comparable to a concentration camp guard, which at the moment he is not murdering, but he's in charge of life and death. And you have the chance while you are in the camp to murder him. Is that considered to be murder? Is that considered to be a sin? No, it's not, because he's a known oppressor and murderer, and if you don't kill him today, he will kill you tomorrow.
Right. I totally agree with that. I mean, there's right. In other words, there are people, well, without right. Let's say I totally agree. And the fact is, that's what I said about, and that's why Moshe is very dangerous to Paro, because this is somebody who actually is striking a blow against the institution of slavery, which Paro puts in place to subjugate the Jews and to limit them and to be able to use them for his own purposes. That's how the book actually begins. Yes, it's the institution which is rotten. So exactly the point. Let's read a little bit more. Let's read more. Now he goes out on day 2. He's walking outside, see what's going on. This time he sees 2 Hebrews fighting. Nitzim is they're fighting with each other. It's a word that appears actually later in the Chumash, actually in last week's parsha, Mishpatim. Ki yiratzu anashim. Nitzim. Vayamar Rasha. So Moshe said to the wicked one, I presume the wicked one who was the more active in terms of beating the other. They're both fighting, but one is called the Rasha. He's about to strike the other. Loma take reyecha. Why do you hit your friend? Reyecha, right? In other words, what excuse? You're not a taskmaster. You're not part of the slavery system. And not only that, I would say something else. I would say something else, which is a very sad thing, but I've seen this. That sometimes people that are abused, actually, they were taken advantage of or abused, sometimes they actually abuse other people, or they don't protect other people. You would think that they would be the first to defend the other, given the fact that they themselves have been the victims, but it doesn't always work that way. So Moshe seems to be surprised. He asks a question, which is not really a question. It's a rhetorical question, which typically is a critique. What are you hitting Re'echa, your friend? This is not slave and master. These are two friends. Why do you hit your friends? Vayomer. So this Rasha, this one who's about to hit the other one, says, Mi samcha ish sav shofet aleinu. Who made you prince and judge over us? How organi ato omer? Do you think about killing me? Kasher harakta hamitzri, the way you killed the Egyptian? Vayira Moshe vayomar, achein noda davar. And Moshe was frightened, and Moshe said, the matter is known. So there's several things to say about this particular verse, which are very striking, and a very important pasuk, actually, because it explains what's going to happen in the next two chapters. This person says to Moshe, who made you a prince or a judge? Right? Who made you a prince or a judge? Let's just focus on that for a minute. That phrase, who made you prince or judge, that resonates with us. Let's pretend we never studied the Bible at all, but we started with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So now we're up to Exodus chapter 2. We studied the 50 chapters in Breshit. We're up to chapter 2. Who made you a sar v'shofet aleinu? That has a resonance with us. And it resonates with actually chapter 19 of the previous book of Sefer Breshit. That's the story when these two angels come to the town of Sodom. And they sleeping in the street, and Lot, Avram's nephew, takes them in. He insists they come to his house. He prepares a little meal for them. Then the people in the town surround the house, and they say to Lot, hand those two fellows over to us, so we can probably sodomize them. So we abuse them. And Lot says to the people of the town, please don't do that. These are my guests. Take my daughters. Okay, leave out the take my daughter part, which is pretty perverse. But in any event, he says, you can't harm my guests. They came under my roof. I have to protect them. And the people in the town say about Lot, you're a stranger in our town. You're going to be a judge? Who made you a judge of us? You're just a stranger. Now, in point of fact, it's interesting about Lot, because part of that chapter 19, he may be a stranger in the town in the great book of Genesis, chapter 19, but we all remember that in chapter 14 of this very same book, the four powerful kings of the north capture the people of Sodom. They take them all away with their property, capture all of them, and Abraham saves them on account of Lot. They're talking to the fellow who is responsible for their existence. Without Lot, they don't exist. So leave them out. But the point that I'm making is, yes, the people of Sodom are very wicked, but here in this pasuk, what the Chumash is presupposing already is a parallel between Sodom on one hand and Mitzrayim on the other. And in point of fact, if you remember back in Sefer Breshit, when Lot first sees Sodom, it's very fertile, Kigan Hashem ki eretz Mitzrayim, like the land of Egypt, like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt. So there is a connection in the Chumash between Sodom and Mitzrayim, and here you see it again. But the point is that they say that this one says to Moshe, who made you a judge? What, you're going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? So in other words, Moshe had wanted to hide the fact that he killed the Egyptian. He buried him under the sand. But this person talks openly. Apparently this person knows what Moshe did and says in a loud, full voice, wait, kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? And even that, by the way, are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? Depending how you read it, it strikes me that there's even a kind of critique. In other words, not just, I know you killed the Egyptian, but what, you're going to kill me? You already killed an Egyptian. You're going to kill me too? There might even be a critique. In other words, part of being a slave in Mitzrayim, and we know this, that sometimes the slave actually, even though they're being abused by the master, nonetheless defends the master, adulates the master. That happens very often. So the way they measure it, they measure themselves by Mitzrayim. You're going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? The Medrash, of course, asks the question, how does he know? How does he know that Moshe killed the Mitri? It says in the previous couple of psukim that Moshe looked this way and that way. Vayar ki ein ish. He saw there was no man, and he smote the Egyptian. So the Medrash asked the question, well, if Moshe looked this way and that way, and there's no man, so how does he know that he killed the Egyptian? I mean, one could easily say, you think no one sees, but many people do see. That is certainly possible. You think you think it's a secret, but very often it's not the secret that you believe it is. People know a lot more than you think. But the Medrash has a different and rather cynical response. Says the Medrash, it is true. There was nobody around and nobody could see. But there's one guy who could see. Who's the one person who could see? It's the one he saved. This is the guy that he saved. This is the one that Moshe saved. He knows what Moshe did because Moshe saved his life. That's the Medrash. You're gonna the way you killed the Egyptian, like yesterday when you saved my life, you're gonna do that? Vayira Moshe vayomar, Moshe was frightened. Ochein noda hadavar, the matter is known. That's what the simple reading is. Noda hadavar, the matter is known. The Medrash, however, and Rashi have a different interpretation. I'm not sure it fits in the words. It's the best reading of the words, but it's a very powerful statement. Ochein noda hadavar, says Rashi. Now I know what the problem is. Now I understand why we're in trouble. Because I'm in this situation where nobody takes responsibility for anybody, because nobody actually wants to stand up to Mitzrayim. On the contrary, they're critiquing me for saving the Hebrew. So achein noda hadavar. And the point here, just take one more pasuk, the point is that they're talking openly about it. They're not hiding it. The way you killed the Egyptian, and maybe there are 20 people standing around. So, because in the very next pasuk, Vayishma Paro et hadavar hazeh, Paro heard this thing, this davar. Moshe said the davar is known at the end of verse number 14, but in verse 15, Vayishma Paro et hadavar hazeh, Paro heard this davar. Vayivakesh la'arog et Moshe, and he sought to kill Moshe for reasons we stated above, namely, this is a fellow who doesn't accept the slavery. Vayivrach Moshe b'nei Paro, Vayeshev b'eretz Midyan, Vayeshev al Abeh. Before we get to Moshe at the well, I wanted to make 2 points maybe, about this verse. In other words, how did Paro find out? I don't think we have to assume that this fellow, this Russia, told Paro. Don't have to assume that. But I think what we can assume is that they are talking openly about it. Moshe had tried to conceal what he does, but the point is he can't. But people are talking. People are talking openly about Moshe. Moshe is the guy who killed the Egyptian, and Vayishma Paro heard this. In other words, the point I'm making is that the Jews, actually, the Israelites, according to this interpretation, are in a sense responsible for the fact that Moshe is he's a wanted man. Paro seeks to kill Moshe, and then Moshe has to run away and go to a different country. He has to go to Midian, where he ends up at a well. We'll get to the well in a few minutes. But the reason I emphasize this, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. The reason I emphasize this is that basically in these 2 psukim that we just read, we discover that Moshe was a good guy who tried to help the Jews, and that actually he's resented by the Jews who blame him for killing the Egyptian. They blame him for killing the Egyptian, and they say, who made you the boss anyway? Who made you a Sar and Shofet? Who are you anyway? Now remember, Moshe doesn't grow up as a Jew. He grows up in the house of Pharaoh's daughter. He looks like an Egyptian. We know that from the next story. And he's not one of them. So maybe that's one of the reasons they resent him. But the second point is not only do they critique him, but they are responsible in one form or another for Moshe having to run for his life. Now, the reason I emphasize this is these are the people that Moshe is supposed to give up his own life. He's living with Yitro in chapter 3. He's married to Yitro's daughter. He has a job. He loves Yitro. Yitro is a good man. He cares about justice. So he's run away to a different land, and he's living. He has a job. He has a wife. He has a family. He has a father that he really loves, who's a religious person, who's the priest. And God suddenly will tell Moshe in the next chapter, leave, go back and save the Jews. But these Jews that Moshe is assigned to save, so far Moshe's interaction with them is not very positive, because they both critique him on one hand, and they say, who made you the judge? Who made you a prince? But Moshe is going to go back as a leader, as a supposed leader. They've rejected his leadership. And not only that, these are the people who indirectly, could be the cause that Moshe could have been killed because of them. These are dafka the people that Moshe is supposed to save. I point this out to make the following, observation. When God will appear to Moshe and say to Moshe, I want you to go back to Egypt to take the people out of Mitzrayim. And Moshe has a lot of different excuses. I can't speak so well. Paro won't know me. They won't believe me. I'm not a good talker. He has 4 or 5 different excuses. And sometimes when people give 4 or 5 different excuses, there's really a 6th reason, which is the real reason. The real reason is that there's something else about not wanting to go. Not the reasons he gives, but there's something else. And the something else I submit could easily be a very simple point. Why should I save them? These people hate my guts. And not only that, they're responsible for me having to run for my life. Why would I save them? So we have to keep these 2 psukim in mind. And Moshe is being asked to save people who have openly rejected him. Not just rejected him, but say, who made you a prince? So again, this will be useful, I think, when we get to the request of Moshe to lead, to go back to Mitzrayim and to save his people. And we'll get back to that. Okay, let me stop at this point and take some comments or questions, then we'll just continue. Are there any comments or questions?
Question.
Yep.
If all this is known to Pharaoh, and then when Moshe comes to him, he doesn't make a connection that this is the same individual, or is Moshe so different at that time that
no, this Pharaoh dies. At the end of the chapter, God says to Moshe, you can go back now. The people that seek your life have all died. It's not the same Pharaoh. It's different Pharaoh. Okay. Now, what is true, Laszlo, what is true is that it's a different person. But in the Chumash, I have argued many times, all the Pharaohs are essentially the same. In other words, there's no real difference between one Pharaoh and the next. What is different about them are the circumstances. So that Paro that we encounter with Yosef, there's the Paro with Abraham, who grabs Sarah because she's pretty. He grabs her. He doesn't ask her one way or the other. He grabs her. Okay, God intervenes with plagues. Then there's the Paro with Yosef, the so-called good Paro. But the good Paro is not so good. He's good as long as he needs you. That's how it works. The moment he doesn't need you, then Yosef can't even get an audience with Paro. He wants to bury his father. He pleads with the people in the court to go to Paro for him. Yosef had thought of himself as Paro's father figure, a master of Egypt, etc. And the truth comes out at the end that as long as you're useful to Paro, he's fine. But the moment you're not useful, he's not fine. And remember, when Joseph goes to bury his father in the 50th chapter of the previous book, last chapter of Sefer Bereshit, the Torah added a seemingly innocuous statement. They all went to bury Jacob, but the women and the children stayed behind. So the point is, that's exactly going to be our story in Sefer Shemot. When Moshe wants to serve God in the desert, you can take it. Take the old people, take the men. And Moshe keeps insisting we need everybody, and Paro keeps saying you're not getting everybody. Because if you take everybody, maybe you'll run away. And we need some hostages. So the Paros don't change. It is a different person, though. In point of fact, God said to Moshe, it's safe to go back because the Paro who sought your life is dead. And we'll get to that verse. Is there anybody else who wants to make a comment or question? If not, yes, please.
I have a question here on verse 15. The
Yes.
verse 15 are incredibly expedited. And when you know, it's like Paro hears about the events, Moshe becomes an outlaw, has to run for his life, etc. Then finds himself in Midian, and here he goes. And it's like, what an expedited turn of events. You're speaking about institutions a little bit earlier on, and we tend to put, castes tend to protect their own, right? This man, Moshe, is presented to us as a prince of Egypt. He should have been protected by his status as a prince of Egypt should have protected him somehow. So it is strange to me, given what we know about it. Even though he killed an Egyptian, what does it matter? We know that, some people in all societies, if they're part of the ruling class, they get a pass, even for bad behavior. So, and so in this instance, Pharaoh, here's the guy, killed an Egyptian, and that becomes the reason of that's why he becomes an outlaw. It's strange. There is, the suspicion about, oh my God, he was always a fifth column in our midst, doesn't appear. There's no nothing here. I mean,
Let me respond this way. First of all, yeah. I don't think in the Chumash, actually, it may be true in the movies, but in the Chumash, you never see a connection between Moshe and Paro. It is true that when Moshe returns, he does get an audience with Paro. That is true. But beyond that, you don't see a relationship. And to make that point very sharply, I would say the following, but I don't want to get too deeply into this because I could go on forever. But there's a story in the beginning of the book of Shmuel that recalls this Moshe and Paro, which is the story of Shmuel, who's a Moshe figure in the house of Eli. It's a very parallel story. There's a little fire is still burning, and God calls to Shmuel, etc. And that story, which is chapter 3 of First Samuel, chapter 3 of Shmuel Aleph, it's a very powerful story because in that story, Shmuel's first mission is to tell Eli, his adopted father of sorts, that God is going to destroy Shiloh. But there's a poignancy to the story because in that story, Eli is Shmuel's Rebbe. Shmuel is his beloved disciple, almost one might say his sort of adopted child. So there you have all of this, the pathos of the relationship. In the Chumash, though, when it comes to Moshe being Paro's daughter adopts him, but at least as far as I can tell, there's never a sense in the Chumash that there's any kind of relationship between Moshe and Paro. Okay. Who knows? Maybe Paro had 100 daughters. Maybe he had 50 wives. Who knows? But the point is, the point I made before is the main point, which is what bothers Paro, I'm sure, is not that Moshe killed somebody. What bothers Paro is that Moshe killed the Egyptian taskmaster who was beating the slave, and that he will not. That he won't countenance. So it is true. The Chumash does not suggest at all that Moshe's status as the adopted child of Paro's daughter is going to protect him. But the point I was emphasizing is that what bothers Paro is, he's not going to give him a pass because this is very dangerous. Because once you start questioning the slavery, which is what Moshe will do later, when Moshe is going to come back, when Moshe returns, and the first time he talks to Paro, he is actually questioning slavery. The first thing that Moshe asks for when he comes back, which Paro absolutely refuses, and we'll get there, he wants the people to take off for a few days to serve God. He wants the people to have vacation days or whatever in the service of God. And that is something that Paro under no circumstance can permit. The one thing he can never permit is for the slaves to stop working. Because the moment you stop working is the moment you have the time when you're not working to actually think about what is going on here. And that's what Paro cannot countenance. Once you have a Shabbos, basically, as Moshe says, give us a Shabbos, that's the one thing he will never do, because the moment you stop working is the moment you can stand back from it for a while and to contemplate. So the point I'm making is what bothers Paro here. I don't think there's no sense in the Chumash there's any kind of relationship, but the point is what bothers him is Moshe's attack upon slavery. That the institution of slavery is what actually concerns him. Okay, is there anybody else who wants to comment here?
Rabbi,
Otherwise, reach out. Yes.
Rabbi Sandra,
Yes.
could the Midrash have been disturbed, just as this this person, young woman who just asked this question, could the Midrash have been disturbed by what they perceived as some sort of relationship between Paro and Moshe when they have that famous Midrash of baby Moses on Pharaoh's knee and reaching toward the coal or reaching toward the diamond or reaching toward the crown? I mean, clearly there's some level of underlayer of protest to the adopted Ivri son of Paro's daughter. So the Midrash picks up on it. And as you said, we have to think, why does the Midrash even talk about this? Is it possible that in fact now we're seeing the Vayishma Paro? I can see very clearly in my little Midrashic mind's eye that these same guys who were saying, look, the little baby is pushing his hand towards the crown. He's bad news. He should be drowned in the Nile. I could see their progenitors or their ancestors saying to Paro, hey, listen to this last thing. I told you we should have killed him 18 years ago. So I think there's something to what she's saying.
Well, there is. I don't think it's in the text so much. I agree with you about the Midrash. What the Midrash picks up on is, in fact, Moshe has been brought up by Pharaoh's daughter. Moshe is, and when Moshe runs away in a few verses later, and the daughters of Reuel, the priest, come home, why are you home so soon? Ish Mitzri Hitzilanu, an Egyptian guy saved us.
It's
For
not
practical purposes, he looks like a Mitzri.
That's right.
He is a Mitzri. I mean, he grew up as a Mitzri. He's raised. Yes, the mother did nurse him first. Yes, the sister watched over him. But the Midrashim typically take these ideas and run with them, and they make the point. He's not just a Mitzri the way he dresses. That, I mean, he's within the house of Paro. It is presumed he's a Mitzri. And the point is, even as a child, they're saying that there's something about Moshe, even as a child, that the focus of his identity, even as a child, even before he goes out, there's something about him that is identified with his mother, with his sister, etc. There's no question. But I think the Medrash does that, and maybe sometimes the Medrash has a certain concept, embellishes it. All I'm saying is, when I read the Chumash, I don't see any relationship at all between Moshe and Paro, except that he gets an audience with him. When he comes back, he goes to Paro and talks to Paro. So that means that somehow he has the ability to make that connection. Not anybody can just walk into Paro. So of course, there is something to that. But in terms of the relationship, I think the story of Eli and Shmuel is a counter to, there you have a relationship. There, Eli is Shmuel's, actually his Rebbe. He's his teacher, he's his father figure, he's his Rebbe. He loves Shmuel. He actually teaches Shmuel how to become a prophet. And of course, the first prophecy is that Eli is doomed. That's a poignant story, but I don't believe in the story over here. The Chumash that I have before me, I don't think suggests a relationship. That's all I'm saying.
I'm just saying that parallel between the Anashim Ivrim that tattle on Moshe, and here you've got the Anashim Mitzrim who are close to Paro. They also are doing the whispering. I think it's like a pox on both the houses. The Ivrim do the tattling on Moshe, so his Echav are no darn good, okay? And the Mitzrim are whispering in Pharaoh's ear and saying, look at this schlep that you brought into the house.
Exactly, according to the Medrash, and actually when you're saying this, it very much reminds us, I don't think it's in the biblical text, but I think that the Medrash is probably seeing Moshe as a kind of Joseph figure. The story of Yosef. When Yosef eats, the Egyptians won't eat with him because he's a Jew, and the Jews don't eat with him because he's an Egyptian. But Yosef is a guy, no matter where you put him, he's always the other. So that, and Moshe is, in fact, the Yosef figure, as we'll see. So maybe that's a good point, and that's probably part of it. Okay, let's continue. We still have some time, but let's do a little bit more here. Let's continue. So, fine. So Moshe runs away now. Vayeshev al Habe'er, he goes to a well. Okay. Next verse number, was it 16, 17? There it is. Kohen Midian Sheva Banot. So the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And they would come, this was their normal routine. They would come to draw water. They would fill the troughs to water their father's flock. So they would come. And apparently the next verse, what would happen every time is, Vayavo Haroim Vayigarshum, but the other shepherds, presumably the men, would come and chase them away. Vayakam Moshe Vayoshiyan. So this time when they're chased away by the other shepherds, Vayakam Moshe Vayoshiyan Vayashket Sonam. So Moshe rose up. Vayoshiyan. It's a very striking word. Hoshi is to save. He redeemed them. He saved them, and he watered their flock. So the very use of the word Vayoshiyan is striking, because Moshe will be the Moshiach of Israel. He'll be God's instrument in God's redemption of Israel. He'll bring about redemption. So here Moshe intervenes again. You would think that this guy, having intervened in the quarrel between 2 Jews, he meant well. Why do you beat your friend? And in the first instance, he killed the Egyptian who was hitting the Jew, and all this caused him to flee for his life. You would think that this fellow has learned his lesson. Don't get involved, it only gets you trouble. But no, he can't help himself when he sees these 7 daughters of the priest being pushed aside. He rises up, he takes their side single-handedly, right? Haroim is plural, so there's one man against the many. He rises up to save them, and he gives water to their flock. In other words, the 3 stories of Moshe. The first is the Egyptian being the Jew. The second is 2 Jews. The third is two non-Jews. It doesn't seem to matter to this fellow who actually is involved. He'll always side with the one who's being beaten or being pushed away. So in the first instance, it was the Jew. In the second, it's the side of the Jew who's about to be hit by the Rasha, Lomatake Reyecha. And then the third case is 2 non-Jews. So it seems to be, when I say justice is colorblind over here, and he just takes their part. All this takes place at the well. Now, we all know, having read the book of Bereshit, that the well has been a place for marriage, and we have 2 stories of the well. In the first episode of the well, in chapter 24, that's where Avram sent his servant to find a wife for Yitzchak. He goes to the well, and he has a test at the well. He sees, he says the one that will come out, and I'll ask her for water to drink, and she gives the camels, she's the right one. And that's the story of Rivka. That's one well story. Then you have chapter 29 of Sefer Bereshit. Yaakov is running away from home, and also running to find a wife. He comes to a well, and the shepherds are standing around, and Yaakov has some questions. To where are you from? They're from Haran, etc. Lavan. Oh, there's his daughter coming. And when he sees Rachel, who's a shepherd, with her flock, Yaakov takes the rock off the well. He runs, and he gives water to Rachel's flock. He gives water to the flock, and he cries, he kisses her, etc. So those are 2 stories. Those are 2 well stories, and those are 2 marriage stories. In the first instance, the basis for marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka are Rivka's qualities of compassion, etc. Later, her ability to leave home. So it's all about one's qualities. Yitzchak isn't even there. He's never seen her. So it's an arranged marriage of sort, but it's based on Rivka's character. That's one marriage. That's marriage number 1. Marriage number 2, Yaakov and Rachel. So in that marriage, the reason for the marriage, the Chumash says, Vayahav Yaakov et Rachel. Jacob loves Rachel. It's not that Rachel is acted in any kind of exemplary fashion. In fact, she doesn't act at all. Unlike the Rebecca story, where she gives water to the flock or to the camels of the servant, in the second story, Yaakov gives water to Rachel's flock. So Rachel does nothing. She doesn't do anything bad, but she doesn't do anything good either. She doesn't do anything. In that case, the Torah says, Vayahav Yaakov et Rachel, that Jacob loved Rachel. So the basis for that marriage is love. The basis for the first marriage is characteristics or qualities of the person. Now we have the third story. In the third story, Moshe saves the daughters of the 7 daughters. Literally, Torah used the word to save. he saves the daughters of Reuel's daughters. So he saves them. And when they come home, in the very next pasuk, Vatovon el Reuel vihen, they go back home to Reuel, the priests, their father. Vayomer madua mihaten bo hayom. He says, girls, why are you back so fast? In other words, the point is this procedure apparently took place every day. Every day they go to the well. Every day they'd be told, go to the back of the line or back of the bus or whatever. You have to wait your turn, which is the end. So they come home at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Now they're back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Says Reuel, why'd you rush home? But what is this? You come home 6 every time. Now it's 3. But Tomana, they said, Ish mitzri hitzilanu miyad ro'im. An Egyptian guy saved us from the shepherds. Not only did he save us, not only that, he also drew water for us and he watered the flock. He does everything. He saves them, he waters the flock, he draws the water for them, and all that. Of course, so Reuel will say, really? So where is he? Bring him home. But the point is, and then Moshe will marry one of these daughters. Yitro will give Tzipporah, his daughter, to Moshe as a wife. So in the first instance, the case of Yitzchak, it was based on character, qualities of the person. The second is a love story. Jacob and Rachel was a love story. In the third instance, though, it can't be based on character because at the end of the day, they don't even invite him home. And their father critiques them for this. The fellow saves you, you invite him home. So it's not based on character. It's presumably not based on love either, given the fact that there are 7 of them. You can't fall in love with 7 women at the same time. You may be able to do it serially over time, but at any one time, I don't think so. So there's no love and there's no character. And yet Moshe will marry Tzipporah. So what is that based on? And of course, the answer is obvious when you read the verses. It's not that Moshe loves Tzipporah. It's not that Tzipporah has demonstrated heretofore that she's of any quality, great qualities. If Moshe loves anybody, it's not Tzipporah. The person Moshe seems to love, minimally highly respect, is this Reuel, the priest of Midian. The priest of Midian is the one that Moshe likes. And later on, it's very explicit. If you skip a couple of verses ahead, in verse number 21, Vayom Moshe Lashevet, we'll go back to the verse we skipped, but Vayom Moshe Lashevet et Ish, Vayitelo Tzipporah b'tola Moshe. Moshe agreed to stay with the man. He consents to stay. And the man, the priest, gives Moses his daughter Tzipporah as wife. In other words, the basis for this marriage has nothing to do with his daughter. The basis is Moshe agrees to stay with the man. This is the fellow. This is where I'm going to be. He thinks he's going to stay there forever. Why wouldn't he think so? He's a fugitive from Egypt. He found this guy who cares about justice, who invites him in, who feeds him. He gives him his daughter, and Moshe loves this man. Therefore, his daughter is given as a way to cement a relationship between Reuel, aka Yitro in the next chapter, and Moshe. This is the difference. You marry into the family. This is a typical, you marry into the family. The families have some connection, and very often the marriage is a function of the family. So these are 3 different models for marriage. I think looking at it from our perspective, from a distance, at these 3 models of marriage in the Chumash, what's pretty clear, I think, is that the one that seems to work the best is the first one, namely Yitzchak and Rivka. There is a mutual respect, there's no question about it. And actually, they seem to care very deeply about each other. Yitzchak certainly cares for Rivka because he prays for her. He prays for Rebecca, his wife. He actually cares about her. She never gets taken, unlike Sarah, who was taken twice. So the model of marriage based on good qualities, he was married to before he ever met her. That doesn't seem to matter for the Chumash. That's the marriage that works. Yaakov and Rachel is a rocky marriage, and Tzipporah and Moshe don't actually stay together. Later on, he sends her away. So there's no real marriage there altogether. So those are the three different models. So the Chumash is obviously the well is the wedding, is the place of marriage, as it were, in these three stories. And the Chumash is telling us three very different stories. In any event, they all came home early. Let's take one more verse over here, and I'll stop and take questions. Yom, it's his verse number 20. So why did you rush home so fast? That's the Egyptian guy saved us, gave us water, etc. He said to his daughters, V'ayo. Ayo is, where is he? But the V'ayo is not just a question. Lama zeh, as the verse continues, Lama zeh azav tenet ish. Why did you abandon him? Kirin lo v'yochal lachem, call him that he may eat bread. Lechem is not really bread. Lechem could be meat also, but that which sustains. He goes, invite him for supper. And the point is, we know from our study earlier in the Chumash that eating together with somebody is not just about a meal. It's also a social act. It's a way to make connections. We know that Yitro, in Parashat Yitro, when he comes to visit Moshe later in chapter 18, after he hears what God has done for Israel, he comes together with Aaron and the elders, Lecho Lechem, with Hashem, to break bread, to eat bread together. So Kirin Lo V'yochal Lachem is invited to eat bread, means to connect. Yitro is excited about this guy. Some guy actually saved you. He saved the weak from the strong. That very much, I call him Yitro. He's called Yeruel. We'll get to Yitro later, but it's the same person. But in any event, in V'ayo, where is he? Is a critique. Why did you abandon him? Call him to eat bread. Now, before I stop and take some comments and questions, I just wanted to point out that verse number 20 actually recalls for us a different verse of the Torah. Very similar verse, but very different verse. And the verse I'm referring to is a verse that we find in the story of Yosef. Yosef, of course, was sold into slavery. He comes to Egypt, and he, chapter 39, he's in Egypt, Yosef Urad Mitzrayma, and he comes to the house of Potiphar. He's a slave, and Potiphar buys a Hebrew slave. And the Torah describes Joseph's unbelievable rise to position of prominence in the house of Potiphar. God is favoring Joseph. Joseph is successful, and Potiphar gives him one. He keeps on giving him a different task. Keeps on raising his level in the house. Starts off as a slave, then he becomes the valet of Potiphar. Then he's in charge of the house. Then he's in charge of the house and the field. And then finally, in chapter 39 of Breshit, verse number 6, Vayazov kol shelo b'yad Yosef, Potiphar Vayazov. He abandoned everything into Joseph's hands. V'lo yada ito me'uma. He didn't even pay attention to what he did. He doesn't know what Joseph does, except for one thing. Kiyam alechem asher hu ochel, except for the bread. Now, the point is, what does the bread mean? So the bread could mean two things in the Joseph story. One is it probably does refer to Mrs. Potiphar, because in the very next story, when she propositions Joseph, Joseph says, listen, I can't do this. Your husband has been so good to me. He doesn't care about anything that I do except for you. Except for you, his wife. So therefore, Joseph makes the connection between the bread on one hand and the wife on the other. That's what Joseph's connection in the ensuing conversation. But I don't think we have to limit it to Mrs. Potiphar, because in the Joseph narrative, which is the last piece of Sefer Breshit, the bread is central. The lechem is central. The world has no lechem because there's a famine. Lechem ein b'chol haaretz. There is no lechem, and Joseph is in charge of the lechem. Potiphar, before his Paro, before his dreams are interpreted, the Torah tells us, executes his baker, the Sarah Ofim. When I say the person in charge of the bread, it's hard to know the extent of this person's being a Sar, but it could well be that he's in charge of the bread in the whole country. In other words, Paro has a problem. He has a problem with the food. Maybe he feels he doesn't control it. And Joseph comes out of jail and tells him how you can control the food. Take the good food. In times of the plenty, you siphon off a lot of the food. you store it, you guard it, and you sell it, and then you'll have everything. If you have the food, you'll have the money, you'll have the cattle, you have the land. That's what Joseph does for Paro. But my point is that when the Torah said that Potiphar gives Joseph everything except for the lechem, when you read the story of Joseph from beginning to end, you ask yourself the question, which is greater, the exception or the rule? The rule, he gave him everything, the exception, except for the bread. But of course, in the Joseph narrative, the bread is everything. Because if you have the bread, you have everything. You have all the money, and you have all the cattle, and you have all the land. But over here, the Chumash says the opposite. We have, over there, it's Vayazov Kashelo Biyad Yosef Yada Itom Me'uma Kim Alechem Hashlochel. But when it comes to this priest of Midian, it's the opposite. Why did you abandon that fellow? Ayo, where is he? That's a critique. It's like the first word that God says when Adam is in the garden hiding. Ayeka, where are you? God knows where he is. But the question, like, where are you? Where you at? What is this? And over here is the opposite. Here's somebody, he's never met this Mitzri. Ish Mitzri. He doesn't know who he is. He's not really a full Mitzri. Ruel doesn't know that. You can't abandon him. Loma Azav 10, but unlike Potiphar, who exempts the lechem from the relationship, Kirin lo v'yochal lechem, call him that it may eat lechem. So here you have a sense of this person never met Moshe, but the very fact that he saved you, this is what this guy's all about. If he saved you, he acts fairly, he cares about equity. This is a guy we got to bring into the house. Kirin lo v'yochal lechem, and not just bring it to the house, but in the very next verse, it's more than that. Vayol Moshe l'shevet et ha'ish, vayitain et tzipora b'tol Moshe. And here too, I would say, call him to eat lechem. The Torah never says he eats lechem, actually. It didn't say, and Moshe came to the house, they had a meal prepared, and he ate bread. It doesn't say that. The next verse says, Moshe agreed to stay with him, and he gave him his daughter as a wife. So here you see, parallel to the Potiphar story, there it said, Yosef had everything except the lechem. Then Yosef says in the ensuing story, he gave me everything except you, identifying the lechem with Mrs. Potiphar. And in this story over here, you can read the same thing into it, because call him to eat lechem. Moshe agreed to stay with the man, and you expect to read, and Moshe ate lechem with Reuel. Doesn't say that. He gave him Tzipora, his daughter, Bito, the Moshe. So Moshe is now married to. I'm not suggesting he's not eating with him, but I'm just suggesting that the lechem can be read in both ways. Both actually eat breaking bread, right? Making that connection, but also the daughter. So Moshe is fully entrenched, fully ensconced into the house of this priest. He's fully connected. He agrees to stay with the man. L'shevet et ha'ish. He agrees to stay with the man, and sounds like a very good relationship. The very next verse, just the one more verse here, Vatelu lo ben, and she bore a child. Vayikra shemo Gershom, he named his son Gershom. Ki omar, ger hayiti b'eretz nachi, for Moshe said, I was a stranger in a foreign land. Now here the question is what that verse means. So let me suggest, and maybe next time we'll pick this up. I would suggest that in this verse, what it means is Moshe is looking back at his past and saying something like, my son is named Gershom. I was a stranger there. What is there? There is Mitzrayim. Moshe says about himself, I was born in Egypt. I was brought up in Egypt. Now I've come to Midian. Now I'm with this priest, this Kohen, who me and we think, well, he values who I am. He values my concern about justice that I've demonstrated in 3 different stories. I realize now that when I was back in Egypt, that wasn't my place. I'm in my element right now. I'm in the land of Midian with my beloved friend, the priest of Midian. So that the Gershom in this verse refers to Mitzrayim. I was a stranger there. I was a ger there. Now, there's more to say about this verse, obviously. But let me stop at this point to take any comments or questions about anything that I've discussed so far today.
Rabbi Silber, at
Yes.
the beginning of this episode with the daughters, there is a triple statement, the rhythm of it. I forget exactly to quote it, and it's not in front of me. It seems excessive. So the rhythm of it reminds me of other triple statements by Ishratsu, by all of this. So can you see a suggestion there as to why this triple measure here?
I would have to see the verse you're referring to. I can't really comment.
It's at the beginning when the daughters of Reuel come, and it's a few pasukim back. I can't.
But the daughters of Reuel come when they come to the well, or when they come home.
Vatovino, Vatidleno, Vatmaleno.
Yes. Oh, that over there. Yes.
Yes.
Right. So I just think, my take on it would be that it's emphasizing everything that they do, right? Because as they report, in other words, they come out, the 7 of them come out, and they are drawing the water, and they are watering the flock, etc. My point is that I think the point is that when they come home, he says, "How come you're home so soon?" Ish Midri, first the Egyptian guy saved us, and then and he also drew the water by Yash. So the point of describing what they do is a way to underscore that when Moshe comes on the scene, he doesn't just help them out. He doesn't just push the other shepherds to say, no, they're first on line. But he actually does all of these things for them. He saves them, and he also draws the water, and he also waters the flock. So the Torah wanted to emphasize more about Moshe. Now, he's a complete stranger who's been burnt by doing exactly this in the past, but apparently it's so much part of his nature that he can't help himself, and he really extends himself to help these 7 young women. He's not just saving them, pushing the others aside, but everything they would typically do, and that's the point. We got right, all that, but is what he does. I have nothing to say beyond that, but I do think it's really more about Moshe doing all of those things. That's why he lays it out. That's what they say to their father. This is what he did. He came, he saved us, he drew the water, he watered the flock. And again, to point out that sort of the opposite of Rebecca at the well, that she does everything. He's just standing there, and she does everything. So this is not a matter of her particular qualities of the women. They do nothing. It's about Moshe's qualities, and they also, it's not a love story either. So therefore, the Chumash is setting up this marriage. And the interest of the Chumash, I think, is more about this priest, Moshe and Reuel. Yitro was a very important person in the story. He's Moshe's only friend. He appears in this chapter. He appears in chapter 3 and 4 very prominently. He will appear again in chapter 18. And in one form or another, he appears in Sefer Bamidbar, I think it's chapter 9. And now chapter 10 it is actually. We'll see that as well, maybe next time. Chova ben Reuel HaMidyani. So we'll see about it. But Yitro is a very important person in the book of Shemot, and we'll deal with this in the future, maybe next week, in fact. Okay, so anybody else?
There are a couple of questions about earlier psukim, but first, Ozzy Orbach asked, but Yitzchak also tells Paro that Rivka is his sister. I think that's a bit of a challenge to, I guess, the idea that Yitzchak and Rivka's relationship was, I guess, as like
maybe you think it's a challenge?
I think,
yeah, I think it's a challenge to what I said. I think it is a support for what I said, actually. Okay. I'll tell you why. Since you raised the question, Ozzy, there's a difference there. When Avram, 2 stories of Abraham, my point is when you read chapter 26, which is Yitzchak's story, when you read it by itself is one thing. When you read it with the Avram stories, you have a completely different feel. I'll tell you the difference. Since you asked the question or pointed this out, thank you. The difference is that when Avram goes to Mitzrayim in chapter 12, before he gets there, he says, we're going to a bad place. So when we get to this bad place, I want you to tell everybody, I am your brother and you're my sister. That's in chapter 12. And then the Egyptians, Pharaoh snatches her. That's chapter 12. Chapter 20. And Abraham traveled to Gerar and he said, she is my sister. That's chapter 20. But when you read chapter 26, first of all, Yitzchak is in Gerar because God said, this is where you have to be. It's not that he chose to go there. God put him there. And the next verse, you look this for yourselves, the people of the town inquired of Yitzchak, and he said, she is my sister. It's not the same as Abraham. Abraham volunteers the information. Yitzchak volunteers nothing. He never says she's my sister. But the people come to him, and they say, who's this beautiful woman? And he's afraid. And he says, she's my sister. And the Chumash is very interesting there. It's always interesting. But the Chumash there says, he was afraid to say that she's my wife, lest they kill me. This is a very subtle point. And since you raised the question, I want to point this out. And when it comes to Abraham's behavior with Sarah, when Abimelech says to Abraham in chapter 20, why did you do this? He questions it. Abraham says, I was afraid. Abraham says, because she is my sister. Abraham says, well, we do this every place we go. But the point is, he has three different excuses, but all we have is Abraham's word for it. We know what Abraham says. When it comes to Isaac, it's different. First of all, they inquire about Rivka, but actually, the Chumash there, if you look at it, you'll see it says, and he said, she's my sister. And then the narrator, the biblical voice says, he was afraid to say wife, lest they kill him. In other words, the Chumash actually, that is the biblical voice, the narrator, tells us the truth. Here's the thing. He volunteers nothing, and she's never taken, by the way. But the narrator says what he's saying is true. He was afraid. And not only that, I'll make another point since you raised the question. When it comes to Abraham, and Avimelech says in chapter 20, hey, I hear she's your wife. Why do you say that she's your sister? Abraham says in his second response, she really is my sister. From the father's side, not from the mother's side, I took her for a wife. With Yitzchak, though, Rebecca's never taken. How does he find out? How does Abimelech find out that Rebecca is not his sister, but his wife? And it came to be as the days passed. He looked out the window. Yitzchak was mitzachek. Mitzachek is often a sexual term. He sees them together. Why this guy is peering through a window is a very good question. But he peers through the window. He sees them together. He says, this ain't his sister. There's no way this is his sister. In other words, the point about Yitzchak is he can't actually conceal that's his wife. You see them on the street. You know what I'm saying? There's some people who are walking together. You can often tell when people are together. You know, are they married? Are they going out? Are they engaged? Are they nothing to do with each other? You know what I mean? You can usually tell if you can read that kind of stuff. And usually you get a sense. With the Yitzchak and Rivka, the point of the story is she's never taken. He volunteers nothing about it. They asked him the question. He's afraid, totally afraid. But then anybody, and furthermore, ultimately you see them together, you know it's his wife. With Abraham is the opposite. Abraham says, why do you say she's your sister? She is my sister. Abimelech turns to Sarah. I gave your brother 1,000 kesef. I mean, God is screaming wife, but Abraham is just, so that's my point about Yitzchak. Yitzchak is very different. I love Yitzchak in the sense, Yitzchak is not a guy who's going to save the world. He has a few people around him, and he cares about each one of them deeply. Nobody dislikes Yitzchak. He cares about Esau, he cares about Yaakov, he cares about Rivka, and he's close to God. And that's the guy he is. He has few relationships. He's not out to save the world. It's not Av Hamon Goyim. He keeps to himself. He works the land. His blessings are from God. He doesn't make his money through manipulation. He makes it by working the land. He's a certain kind of person. He has few relationships, but they're very deep. And one of those deep relationships is Rivka, whom he prays for. Abraham never prays for Sarah. He prays for himself. He's not going to pray for Sarah. He prays for Rebecca to have a child. He has no children himself, but he prays for her. That's what I mean by a deep relationship. I mean, it's more complex, but that's my point. The very verse you cited, it demonstrates what I'm saying, actually. He volunteers nothing. They ask the question, what's he going to say? So he says, to protect himself, yes. The only good answer, he was afraid for his life. He thought they may kill him, which does not speak well for Avimelech and his land. But if he thought that way, and the Torah says he was that, it's the truth, he really was afraid. The Chumash says that. We don't have to rely on what he says. The Chumash attests to his veracity. All right, I have to stop. Anyone? There's one more question. I'll take it. Go ahead.
Okay. One more is from Ruth Reisner, who asks, the word Omer seems a bit off. Does it imply that the Rasha thought Moshe had the power to kill him with speech? So I think, yeah.
Let me see that. Wait, hold on 1 second. Yes, so that is a very interesting point. That's a very good point. That Ruth has that point. There is a medrash. There's a very well-known medrash. How did Moshe kill the Egyptian? So there's a medrash that he killed the Egyptian by uttering God's name, the name of God with 4 letters, the holiest name. That Moshe cursed him with God's name, and he died. And maybe the medrash is picking up on Ruth's point. Ata Omer. That's the medrash. It's exactly what the medrash says. But I think the medrash might be saying something else in addition to that, which is the medrash might be bothered by the question we asked in the very beginning, which is Moshe's behavior actually, justice? Because it seems not proportionate. Because that someone was beating X and Moshe kills him. And maybe the medrash that he killed him by pronouncing the divine name is the way somehow to respond to that question. He doesn't really kill him himself. He leaves it up to God, and God decides to kill him, So the Midrashim and the Medrash I mentioned earlier about that this guy wasn't just beating up the Egyptian, but he was playing with the guy's wife on top of it. That's also perhaps trying to address this question of fairness. We'll come back to this question about the proportionality later. It will come up later, but I don't want to talk about it now. But we'll stop at this point. And so we'll continue next week with Moshe in the house of Yitro, and there's a little section before that, and the story of the burning bush. That's next week's class. Okay, we'll stop here then. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Silber, and thank you to everyone for joining us. The Springsman is just getting started, and there are a lot of great classes you can sign up, where you signed up for this one, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.